everybody. Welcome to our second half of the Ancient Greece lecture. I wanted to go over a couple of architecture terms before we got started for today, just so that everybody was on the same page. There are scores of terms related to ancient Greek architecture, and I'm not going to burden you with all of them. There are names for each of these individual steps and each of the sections of the capital of the column, but I've simplified it down as much as I can to make things easy. So this triangular shaped stone at the top is called a pediment. The horizontal lintel-like structure, typically some sort of like decorative element is on it. This is called a frieze, F-R-I-E-Z-E. And then the lintel below it, which is typically unadorned, is called an architrave. This is a column. You should all know this by now. The top of the column is called the capital. Capital is typically a word to mean like the one at the top or the first one. This part of the column is called the shaft, and then the part of the column that interacts with the ground is called the base. This part of the temple, like the first kind of step, what we would call like a plinth, is called a stylobate. So just keep these terms in mind as we're going through. So our next work is the Acropolis. So the Acropolis is very close to one of the works that we've covered previously, which is the Athenian Agora. You'll remember this is an outdoor marketplace turned civic center. One of its main features is the fact that it has this road going through it called the Panathenaic Way. So the Panathenaic Way continues up to intersect with a lot of the major structures of the Acropolis. So the Acropolis is describing this entire structure up here, and there are lots of buildings associated with the Acropolis. Here is a detailed rendering of those different buildings. The College Board only wants you to know the Parthenon and the Temple of Athena Nike in terms of structures. There are going to be several friezes and sculptures within these two structures that we'll be talking about. So this complex of structures is located on a hilltop. You'll recall from our other units in ancient history that height is of pretty high importance in the ancient world. Typically that means you are close to the gods, you are close to the sky. Also, this is the highest point in the city, so you can preside over everything from this region. It is a strategic location. So the Acropolis and most of its buildings were built after the sacking of Athens by the Persians. So the Greeks won it back under the direction of Pericles after the original Acropolis was destroyed. So there were a couple of original structures in the Acropolis, one of which was an older temple of Athena. So there are ruins present today of this old temple, and then there have been new things built since the retaking of Athens by the Greeks. So there's a lot of stuff that's been written by historians from this period about the Acropolis, and there was a lot of scandal associated with it as well. So Pericles basically had lots of tributes from the Athenians and their Greek allies, and these were funds that were used to fund the war against the Persians. So there was some money left after the Persians were defeated, and instead of distributing that money back to the people who had given Pericles money for the war treasury, he basically spent it all on one giant monument in Athens, which of course only benefits the Athenians. So there were tons of people, particularly people not from Athens, that were writing about this and super pissed about it. So the Parthenon, which is the main structure of the Acropolis, was never really a temple in the strictest sense because it did not have an altar. So an altar, again, is a place where you give offerings to the gods, or in monotheistic religions, a single god. But it has served as a place of worship for many civilizations that have occupied Greece in the millennia since it was built, including the Roman Catholics, the Byzantines, and the Ottomans. It has sustained damage on many occasions as well, particularly in the last couple hundred years. So again, this is just an overview of the Acropolis and its various buildings. We'll be covering the Parthenon, as well as the Elgin marbles and the plaque of the Ergostines, and then within the Temple of Athena Nike, Nike adjusting her sandal. So this is the temple of Athena Nike, or Nike as it's pronounced in ancient Greek. So this is at the entrance of the Acropolis right here. So this was intended to be a very commemorative temple. Nike is featured quite prominently within this particular temple. She is the goddess of victory. She's typically shown with wings, flying in a battle scene to crown the victor. So this particular temple, as indicated by the narrative friezes along the top of the structure, is basically illustrating these events that happened in the Battle of Marathon when the Greeks obtained victory over the Persians. So you've probably heard the word marathon before, referring to a race that's 26.2 miles. So the reason that marathons are called marathons is because there was a dude that ran 26.2 miles to let the Greeks know that they had won, and then he dropped dead because people aren't supposed to run 26.2 miles. That's just my take. So this particular building is amphira style. It's not very common in ancient Greek architecture. You'll never see this word again, probably, unless you go on to study ancient Greek architecture in college. But it basically means 4 columns in the front and 4 columns in the back. The columns that were used in this particular temple were Ionic, which is pretty typical of the classical era. This is a reconstruction here of the altar. It probably also was painted, and the paint has since worn away. This is the Parthenon, not the Pantheon. The Pantheon, which we'll cover in a couple of weeks, is Roman. So this is the Parthenon with an R. So the Parthenon had idealized proportions that were basically reflected in its construction. 8 columns on one side, 17 on the other, reflecting this mathematical formula that was supposed to create an ideal proportion. So the floor actually curves up. It's convex, so it slightly bubbles upwards so that when it rains, the water doesn't collect on the surface of the temple floor on the stylobate. So we saw something similar with the White Temple and ziggurat in ancient Mesopotamia. So the columns at the corners are also slightly thicker than the ones that are not, because the Greeks thought that basically when the light hit the building that there would be some distortion happening in terms of the light would diminish the appearance of these. So the building is also slightly curved on the outside. I know it doesn't show it in this diagram. I haven't been able to find one where it shows the sides bowing outward a little bit. It's very, very slight, but this is something that the Greeks did to basically make it look good from as many angles as possible. We see Doric and Ionic columns in this building. And at one point, the Parthenon was said to house this massive statue of Athena that was about 40 feet tall and plated in gold and ivory. You can imagine that as ancient Greece was taken over by different civilizations over the centuries, that they would have probably plundered the statue and melted down the gold and used the ivory for other things. So there's various friezes, again, these narrative strips and pediment sculptures that contain narratives related to Athena as well as important battles that the Greeks and the gods were involved in. So there's some friezes that depict the Trojan War. There's some that depict gigantomachy and amazonomachy, which is basically fighting with giants and fighting with the Amazons, respectively. There's also a pediment on the very front that depicts Athena's birth, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then there's also on the other side Athena's contest with Poseidon. So this little diagram right here basically tells you what is happening in these friezes around the Parthenon. So there is a scale reproduction of the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee, of all places, and it contains this fabulous reconstruction of the Athena statue. And there is an actual human person there for scale to give you a sense of how large this thing was. So these are the Elgin marbles, also known as Helios, Horses, and Dionysus. You'll notice that this collection of sculptures right here has a triangular composition. So there were various sections of the Parthenon and of the Acropolis in general that were excavated, and they were not excavated well. during the removal of the Elgin marbles, a lot of parts were broken off and destroyed because the people that were excavating it were impatient and incompetent. So this is what we have left of it today. So we have Helios in the left corner. So Helios is the god of the sun. He basically has a chariot drawn by horses that carries the sun across the sky in Greek mythology. We have Dionysus right here, who is presumably drinking because he is the god of wine. And then we also have Demeter and Persephone here, who are mother and daughter. And then we're not entirely sure who this is, but there's another section of the frieze that is not shown here that shows Athena's birth. And basically how Athena was born is that Zeus had a headache, and then he called up Hephaestus, one of his brothers, to cut his head open because apparently the headache was super bad, and then Athena appeared fully formed and clothed and grown from his head when he was stricken with an axe. So we're seeing here a lot of classical conventions of Greek figure work. We have these contrapposto figures. They're in these naturalized, slumped positions. We also have wet drapery on the female figures and nudity in the male figures. So this is an example that's not from the Parthenon of a typical pediment sculpture. As you can see, the figures are arranged in such a way to fit inside of this triangle. So on this left-hand side here, we have a relief sculpture from the Temple of Athena Nike. This is of Nike adjusting her sandals. So this is a high relief sculpture. Parts of her wings have been broken off, but she did have wings in this image. And this is depicting a figure using wet drapery, which is again very typical of the classical era. This is also a fairly awkward pose. You can imagine, like, whenever you've tried to adjust your shoe that you're practically off balance. But in this instance, it's shown with grace and poise because she's a goddess. This particular image right here is from the Panathenaic frieze, and it's called the Plaque of the Ergostines. So this was meant to be seen from below, so you would look up and see it on right above the lintel of the building. So the areas at the top are more deeply incised into the surface so that when you're looking up at it, then you can see all the detail instead of only seeing things at the bottom and the stuff at the top disappearing. So this depicts events from the Panathenaic Festival. So remember, the Panathenaic Festival is this annual celebration that's happening in Athens that honors the patron goddess Athena. The Ergostines were these 6 women, typically of highborn status, that were basically their job was weaving the peplos shawl for the statue of Athena. Remember that 40-foot tall statue right here. So their job was to weave the shawl that would clothe the statue every year. In this particular image, we are seeing isocephalism, which you'll remember is this word that means the figures are on the same ground level and their heads are around the same height. We're also seeing evidence of contrapposto as well as drapery. Moving on to our next artwork, I know there's a lot of stuff associated with the Acropolis. This is the gray stele of Hegeso, attributed to Callimachos. So we saw in the Archaic period that the ancient Greeks used these Koros and Kori statues to mark their graves. So remember these full-sized, like 6 to 6.5 foot tall sculptures of men and women. In the classical era, the Greeks tended to use stelae that very much resemble the headstones and crypt statues that we might see in cemeteries in the Western world today. So typically, these crypt statues would have the outer structure of a Greek temple or building. We have the pediment here, right here, and 2 columns. The inscription above the figure describes this figure as Hegeso. She's the commemorated individual in this image, and her father. Basically, for women who were unmarried, they were also identified by their father's name. So Hegeso was the daughter of a wealthy man. He was wealthy enough to have this gray stele commissioned. So she is sitting on this really lavish, well-made stool, and she's admiring this jewelry in a jewelry box. So the jewelry was painted on and not actually carved in relief on the statue, so it looks like she's looking at invisible jewelry at this point in time, but on the original statue, the jewelry was painted. So the jewelry might have represented the dowry that was never paid because she was never married. So the scene is very closed and private. We can see that the figures are very much fitting inside of this space that is constructed by the architecture here. So this is reflecting a setting that Hegeso and women like her might have occupied and seldom left during their lifetime. So remember from our previous section of the lecture that Greek women were expected to stay inside and attend to domestic duties, basically not seen or really heard in the public sphere unless there were specific events like the Panathenaic Festival. So men's grave stelae at the time showed them out in public or acting as warriors. Oftentimes they're surrounded by other figures or they're engaged in an active battle. They're very public, whereas settings that are commemorating women and girls tend to be a lot more private and isolated. So this figure right here is probably a slave or a servant. A lot of people tend to interpret this statue as like these two are friends or like associates, but they're not really looking at each other. Like Hegeso is only looking at her jewelry. The servant is not really a person that like is portrayed as being important to her. So here's a couple of other examples of grave stelae from the classical period. We're seeing lots of different ages and demographics being represented. One of my favorite grave stelae is this one of a girl with her pet doves right here. There's also examples of warriors, like this image right here. And then there's also images of athletes as well. So a very common sculptural motif in ancient Greece is the athlete, and he's basically covering his body in olive oil and then scraping it off. So this is his little boyfriend right here, who's helping him cover his body in oil and then scrape it off. Moving on to the Hellenistic period. So we're going to be starting with sculpture. So one of the biggest things that you're noticing in Hellenistic period sculpture is this expansion in terms of the kinds of emotions and expressions that you're seeing on figures. That doesn't mean that every figure is going to have a very emotive facial expression, but you're definitely going to be seeing figures that are anguished. You'll see figures that are drunk or sleeping, or happy, or sad, or whatever. So we're seeing an element of humanity and humanness that is being injected into depictions of figures. And we're not really seeing that in earlier Greek artwork. So when we're looking at these figures right here, like no matter what they're doing, whether they're with their pet doves, or on the battlefield, or chilling out, like being an athlete, their facial expressions are all very placid. This is consistent with a lot of the work that we're seeing in ancient Greek artwork up until the classical period, this very placid look. But at this point in time, we're starting to see more expressions, and then we're also seeing figures that are not just goddesses and gods and male athletes. We're seeing people that are old, we're seeing people that are young, we're seeing people that are drunk, despairing, dying, etc. Another thing that we're also seeing is that women are nude. This is not something that we would have seen in the classical era. Basically, it becomes like socially acceptable to have women to be depicted nude in artwork. So oftentimes they're in these kind of like very like sexy poses, or they're like, oh, I'm trying to be modest, but I'm not. Oftentimes the arms would kind of indicate more of these gestures, but of course in sculptures like the Venus de Milo, we no longer have the arms to know exactly how they looked. We also see negative space used more freely. So remember that at the very beginning of ancient Greek sculpture, the sculptures tend to be very monolithic and rigid. They're very obviously carved from a single piece of stone. Whereas when we're going into the Hellenistic period, we're seeing these sculptures that almost defy gravity in terms of how they're being rendered. Like you never would have seen this use of negative space in an archaic or a classical period sculpture from ancient Greece. There's also a sense of motion and movement to a lot of these sculptures. Oftentimes they're placed in a central area rather than against a wall. They're meant to be viewed from multiple angles, and oftentimes there's a sense of motion. You can sense that there is a wind billowing through the winged Victory right here, or that this figure is turning in time and space. So this is the Winged Victory, or Nike, of Samothrace. So this particular sculpture was found in this area called the Sanctuary of the Great Gods on the island of Samothrace, hence her name. At the top of this two-tiered fountain that was created to emulate the prow of a ship breaking through the waves. So you might recognize the sculpture from the Beyonce and Jay-Z video that we watched at the very beginning of the year. As I mentioned in that lecture, the Nike figure, this winged woman that is oftentimes carrying a tiara, is a symbol of victory. Oftentimes she is depicted in these narrative friezes where the Greeks are winning a battle and they're doing well. In this case, the statue might have commemorated a naval victory, so a victory that's happening in the ocean. So what's remarkable about the statue, aside from the fact that it is as intact as it is for being an outdoor sculpture, is the sense of movement. Like, remember that this is marble, a single slab of marble that has been artfully carved by an artist to create this very dynamic sculpture with tons of negative space. We're also having this contrapposto right here, so the alternating weight on the legs and in the arms, and the figure is twisting her torso to create this sense of movement and drama. Again, as I mentioned previously, there's also a wind that is carrying along the wet drapery of the figure and blowing it back in certain areas. So again, the sculpture is pretty heavily damaged, but the hands might have once held a victory crown and or a welcoming or an open gesture. This is the seated boxer. This is what I mean by you're seeing more emotion in the faces of these statues. You can see here that his eyebrows are pinched. He's obviously not having a great time. He's also a bit of an older figure than we're typically seeing in the classical era, especially when it comes to athletes. Typically, when we see athletes, they are at the moment of victory. They are flawless and almost godlike in how they carry themselves. They're usually standing or holding a spear. And their faces are very placid and calm. But when you look at the seated boxer right here, he's sitting down, his shoulders are slumped, his back is arched, and he's looking up as if he's looking at an opponent that has bested him. There's also this beautiful modeling on the face that's showing these cuts and bruises. There was actually copper that was used to create these red sections on the face to show that he's bruised and bloody. His nose is broken. When you look at the sides, he has cauliflower ears, which is basically what happens to ear cartilage when you've been in too many boxing matches and sustained blunt force trauma to your ears. He's not having a great time. He also has blood and cuts on his knuckles, and his hands are wrapped in these leather thongs, which are basically the ancient equivalent of boxing gloves. So this is a Hellenistic twist on a classical subject that was a favorite of the Greeks. So this is really reflecting the Hellenistic trend of evoking heavy emotion while also capitalizing upon the use of negative space. We have this stone right here that is being used as the base of the sculpture, and then the sculpture is cast in bronze right here, and we're seeing lots of negative space between the legs and in the arms. There's a lot of signs of wear at the toes, so it is thought that athletes might have kissed or touched the statue for good luck on the toes. I know, kind of weird. So bronze sculptures are pretty rare nowadays, especially from ancient periods, because most of them were melted down for scrap metal, or when people became especially desperate in wartime, they needed spearheads and arrowheads rather than art. So this particular sculpture was found in a public bath, but a lot of surviving bronzes were found in shipwrecks. Typically, the Greeks would trade for wares across the ocean. Inevitably, some of those ships sank, and a lot of statues that were metal have been found in shipwrecks, or a lot of them have actually washed up on the shore randomly. In terms of architecture, after Alexander the Great's death, we kind of see democracy shifting in a lot of areas of ancient Greece. We have lavish court cities emerging all around the Mediterranean as the Greek kings are basically calling dibs on various pieces of land. So Pergamon becomes a pretty large, significant settlement in modern day Turkey. We also have Antioch in modern day Syria, and then Alexandria in modern day Egypt. So all this land that had been unified under Alexander the Great is suddenly sectioned off after his death. So cities and buildings at this point in time are becoming more cosmopolitan in nature. That means that there's like more different kinds of people, different kinds of cultures, and different kinds of influences that are being injected into the culture of the city. So there's lots of local cultures and traditions that are integrated into elements of like existing Greek architecture. And because of that, you're starting to see a lot of like classical architecture rules from Greece being broken and retrofitted to match these more regional styles. We're oftentimes also seeing grandiose scale and heightened opulence. The kings really like to show off how much wealth and power they have, so they're going to build these massive monuments to show everybody how cool they are. So this is perhaps the most famous of the Hellenistic Greek works of architecture. It's called the Great Altar of Zeus and Athena. Amazingly, even given how big this is only a small section of the altar. And the altar itself is only one small section of this gigantic Acropolis in Pergamon, or modern day Turkey. So this is the section that was excavated by the Germans about 150 years ago and then transported to Berlin, where it currently resides. So there's an actual like back portion of the altar right here that contains the actual like offering spot, as well as this part of the porch right here. So as you can see from the measurements on this diagram right here, this complex was quite large, around 100 feet long and around 95 feet wide. So again, only a portion of it is in Berlin right now. So the altar was placed on top of a platform elevated by this massive flight of stairs. To give you a sense of scale, this frieze right here, which wraps around the bottom, is around 8 feet tall. So the figures are larger than life. The monument itself is supported by Ionic columns. This frieze, which you would typically expect kind of like on the top margins above the architrave of the building, is instead being transported down here and enlarged. This is what I mean by the rules of architecture being broken in the Hellenistic period. And the frieze itself extends for almost 400 feet, decorated by these high relief sculptures of these figures. So these frieze figures are pretty typical of ancient Greece, as in like people fighting lots of gods. The images that are being depicted in this particular sculpture group right here is gigantomachy, which is basically this fancy word that means fighting or war with giants. So Athena is chilling out here. She is grabbing the hair of this giant and basically wrestling him into the ground. Gaia, who is the goddess of the earth, is basically like, why are you hurting my children? And then Nike, as always, is flying in and putting a tiara on Athena, basically saying, you did good. So again, what you'll notice in these particular images is that you're seeing pain and anguish in the figures that are being conquered. This is not something that you would have seen in the classical era. So there's lots of different artworks from this period and from the Pergamon complex, including this famous statue of the dying Gaul, that are reflecting this very human emotion. So this gigantomachy, this fight between the Greeks or the fight between the Greek gods and the giants, was intended to basically be a foil to the Greeks fighting with their own enemies, particularly the Persians and the Gauls. So Gaul is basically, excuse me, the Gauls were basically the quote-unquote barbarians that live in what is now France. So again, massive Acropolis, similar to the one that we're seeing in Athens, that has lots of various palaces and civic buildings and commemorative statues and groups that are forming this complex. I believe that the Romans were also involved here because that Trajan's temple, so Trajan was a Roman emperor. So in terms of painting, we don't know much about painting from the Hellenistic period of Greece. What we do know, we can typically ascertain from mosaics that were made by the Romans. So you'll recall that the Romans really loved ancient Greek artwork, particularly sculptures and paintings. So oftentimes they would make copies of these sculptures and paintings and then put them in their houses or their civic centers. So these paintings were oftentimes copied in the form of mosaics. So mosaics are images that are composed of colored stone tiles or tesserae. They're very small, they're typically square-shaped, and you can use lots of different colors to create these composite images. So this entire image right here is composed of tiny little tiles, as is this one right here. So based on what we have of these mosaics, we can ascertain that paintings were quite grand in scale and in complexity, oftentimes depicting multiple figures and foreshortening these complex scenes where you see a foreground, a midground, and a background. There's also a suggestion of incredibly fine detail and realism. So our painting, quote unquote painting, from the Hellenistic Greek period is the Alexander Mosaic. So the Alexander Mosaic was actually found in Pompeii, which you'll recall is the city in Rome that was covered in ash and basically preserved. So this mosaic was probably made off of a Greek mural made around 310 BCE. We don't have evidence of that mural. The original painting, though, was commissioned by a king based on historical records. So this is a chaotic depiction of the Battle of Issus, where Alexander the Great, who is right here, is defeating the Persians and forcing their king Darius III to retreat. So Darius III is this dude right here. You can see he has kind of a gobsmacked expression on his face. He's obviously not having a great day. He's reaching out kind of like, oh crap, as he's seeing one of his guards being impaled right here. So this piece has this incredible demonstration of perspective. We're seeing many, many figures going back. We have this tree over here in the background that is kind of hazy in terms of the way that it's being depicted to show that it's back in space and not in the foreground. We have these leading lines that are made by the spears towards the left side of the composition and leading us to Alexander the Great over here. There's also these beautiful detailed highlights on the armor as well as on Darius's shirt right here that are creating these two focal points in this incredibly chaotic and busy scene. Interestingly, while we see this kind of gobsmacked expression on Darius where he's obviously fearful, you can see that his mouth is slightly open, we see Alexander the Great have a very determined expression. He's not really fazed by this chaos. He's continuing to move forward. He has a spear at the ready. He's on his horse. He's ready to go. And he's making eye contact with Darius as if to say, "You're next." So Darius is basically on his chariot right here, and he's telling his charioteer to hightail it out of there and retreat. So the fact that this image was replicated in a Roman house adds to evidence that Romans highly revered and respected the Greeks, as well as their military might and their artwork. So this image, from what I've read, is composed of over 1.5 million tiles. So you can imagine that a person would have to be quite wealthy to afford to have something like this in their home.